Well, I'm very pleased that tonight, and we've got a good turnout, so I appreciate y'all coming out tonight. I'm very pleased to have Brooks Blevins. He's a historian, and he's a Noel Boyd Professor of Ozark Studies at Missouri State University in Springfield. And he said he's also a native of Izard County and has a place over there that he comes to in the summertime. So, murder, mayhem, and the North Arkansas Civil War that refused to end sounds pretty interesting. So, I wanted to introduce Brooks Blevins.
Mr. Blevins, I'll stand here to get the lights adjusted the way they need to be
Okay,
for your presentation.
all right. Let's see, I think this is on. Am I picking up anything? Okay, all right. Thanks, Jennifer, for the introduction, and thanks, Mr. Benedict, and for everyone who was involved in inviting me here this evening. It's great to be indoors today.
Amen.
I was in my garden this morning, and after I got through picking peas and green beans, I decided I don't need to water because I've sweated all over these plants so much that I've watered them as I stooped and gathered things. But it's nice to be here in Mountain Home. I have deep roots here in Baxter County, just about as deeper roots as I have in Izard County. I'm a direct descendant of Jacob Wolf, and there may be others out here. Jacob Wolf had, I think, close to 20 children, so we're not an exclusive group. The direct descendants, there are many of us, but I do trace my lineage back to Mr. Wolf and the Wolf House. And two of my grandparents were born within 5 miles of Mountain Home. One of them just a few miles south of here, down whatever highway number that is, right there that we're across from. And my maternal grandfather was born up on Pigeon Creek. And neither one of them grew up in Baxter County. He didn't, because they lost their land to Norfolk Lake. And we're still sore about that after all these years. He's not around to be sore about it, but he's passed it on to me, and I'm officially sore about the Army Corps of Engineers taking our land. And my paternal grandmother, who was born here in the county, her grandfather was a Baxter County judge in the early 20th century. And after he and her grandmother died, they moved to Izard County. And so all my family left Baxter County in the early 20th century, but I still enjoy coming back and still have a lot of connections up here. Well, I'm going to talk about some Baxter County folks, only there was no Baxter County in the era that I'm talking about. We're going to get back just a little bit before Baxter County came along in 1873. We're going to be talking about mainly 1867 and 1868. And if you are a Civil War historian or a Civil War buff, and you realize, wait a minute, that's after the Civil War, that's what we're talking about, after the Civil War, and that's why it's called the Civil War that wouldn't end. This is a continuation of the violence of the Civil War in the years after the Civil War. And hopefully some of this is new to you and interesting. We're going to talk about several murders. We're going to talk about the Ku Klux Klan. We're going to talk about all kinds of crazy stuff that tore loose in the years when peace had supposedly come to our land, when in actuality it had not. So just a really quick background to what we're going to talk about. Just kind of the overall American and Arkansas and Missouri historical background to this. We know that at least the last couple of years of the Civil War in the Ozarks, and that's what I'm talking about here, North Arkansas, Southern Missouri, was absolutely terrible. It was guerrilla warfare run amok. There was a complete breakdown of law and order. There was nowhere to be safe, pretty much. Wherever you were, it kind of depended upon who held the soil. If it was pro-Union people or pro-Confederate people, and generally, if you didn't agree with them, you found a way to get out and go somewhere where there was a friendlier overlords in charge. But that's the way all of southern Missouri was, all of northern Arkansas was. It was just a sort of no man's land, a very dangerous place. And it was a place where people learned, sort of almost unlearned, to be civil and to be humane. It was a place where killing became second nature for many people. And that's hard to put down in the spring of 1865 just because a few generals hundreds of miles away surrender, and just because the federal government says, okay, the war is over. It doesn't go like that. We see that in the modern world today in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and all these places in Africa, where just because some high-level diplomats proclaim an end to violence, it doesn't work out that way. The violence continues, and it certainly did here in North Arkansas and southern Missouri. We also get a situation in the years that the Civil War ends in 1865, and for the next year and a half or so, there's a lot of political turmoil, there's legal turmoil, as the country is trying to put itself back together, and that's hard to do. There are competing interests. The Confederates come back home to Arkansas, and they want to pick back up like things had been in 1861 before the war started. The Union veterans said, let's not do that. Let's not go back to the way things were. You guys are traitors, and we're going to make sure you remember what you've done, what you've caused this country, and we're gonna punish you for that, and we're going to cut you out of the political process. So that's all going on in the years right after the war. The federal government establishes something called the Freedmen's Bureau. It's actually called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, but in history we just call it the Freedmen's Bureau. It's a lot easier. And there was actually a Freedmen's Bureau agent established in 1866 in Fulton County. And of course part of Baxter County in 1866 was in Fulton County at that time. Kind of the eastern part of Baxter County was in Fulton County. And those of you who are natives of this area, or if you know Fulton County very well, you may know there's where the little community of Union is. You might know where Union is. You've been through Union. It's right on the Izard County line. It's just a spot in the road. There's a church there and a big cemetery, and now there's a store. Somebody's opened up a store in an old rock building there. But that's where the Freedmen's Bureau office was located, of all places, in Union. At that time, Fulton County actually extended several miles down into what today is Izard County. So it wasn't quite as on the edge of the county as we would think of it today. But the fellow's name was Simpson Mason, and we're going to talk a lot about Mr. Mason. Simpson Mason was the Freedmen's Bureau agent for Fulton County, and as such, he became the Freedmen's Bureau agent for all of North Arkansas, pretty much between White River and Black River, and even lopping over those rivers a little bit. So he had a huge territory to cover, and we'll talk in a minute just a little bit about what he did. The Freedmen's Bureau, in most places in the country, was set up to help freed slaves transition into lives of freedom. Help them find jobs, help them, most of them were illiterate, help them sign labor contracts with their bosses to make sure they didn't get cheated and things like that. Well, as you might expect, there weren't that many freed slaves in Fulton County or anywhere between Black River and White River. There were a few hundred, but there weren't that many compared to other parts of the South. And so a lot of his work had to do with those refugees in there. And if you don't know what a refugee was at this time, it was a pro-Union person who had fled Arkansas during the Civil War because it was too unsafe for them to remain here, and they came back after the war. And they were often referred to as refugees. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was in part set up to kind of protect and help these folks as well. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Now what happens in 1866, and I've got awful excited here, or something's turned on. I'm not sure. Okay, honey. Okay, I accidentally turned that. I had two mics going at one time. What happens in 1866, or late 1865, is the Supreme Court of Arkansas outlaws a law that had been passed that kept all the ex-Confederates from participating, from voting. And what had happened is late in the Civil War, a law had been passed that said if you had been a Confederate or part of the Confederacy, then you can't vote. You're a traitor, and we're not going to allow traitors to vote. Well, the Arkansas Supreme Court struck that law down. And so in 1866, when the elections happened, what do you think happened? All those old Confederates went to the polls, and they elected themselves to offices. And all of a sudden, Arkansas and a lot of other states around the South, their state houses in places like Montgomery and Jackson and Little Rock are filled with old Confederates. And they're running the state governments again. And they're not sorry for what they did. They were supposed to be sorry for what they did, but they're not at all sorry for what they did. And in Little Rock, the old Confederates who had come back into office, they passed a bunch of laws that limited the freedoms of black people. They didn't try to re-enslave them, but they limited their freedom to move around and gather and things like that. They even debated a resolution that would have officially thanked Jefferson Davis for his service as president of the Confederacy. And we look back today and think that's just not using very much common sense to do that kind of thing. Even if you felt it, you should have known what was going to happen, because what happens is the federal government in Washington D.C., which is still refusing to seat any of the congressmen and senators from the southern states, so it's dominated by Yankees. The federal government says, all right, South, if you're going to be that way, if you're going to spit in our face after we've whipped you in this war, then here's what we're going to do. And in the spring of 1867, the national government passes a series of acts called the Military Reconstruction Acts. And they send blue-coated troops back into the South, not as many as there were in the Civil War, but they send Union troops back into the South to occupy the South. They forced the southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, which is the amendment that assures black people their civil rights. They eventually will force the southern states to ratify the 15th Amendment, which is the amendment that gives black men the right to vote. And they cut, once again, they pass these laws that cut all of the ex-Confederates out of the voting process. So the Southerners basically shoot themselves in the foot by all the actions that they take when they take back over their state governments in 1866. And as a result, they get themselves back under military occupation. And they get themselves kind of cut out of the political process. They lose power because of this. So that's the background to our story today. By the time the middle and the latter part of 1867 rolls around, the old Southerners, who would become the Democratic Party in the post-Civil War era, they've been cut out of the process. The government of Arkansas is being run by the Republican Party, and the most powerful people in the Republican Party are what were called carpetbaggers. They were mostly former Union soldiers from up north who had settled in Arkansas after the Civil War, and now they were running things. And for them, that's the way it was supposed to be. We're the winners. To the victors go the spoils. We're running the state. We're the ones who know how to do this because these Southerners have messed everything up. And so that's the situation that we get into. And so that leads us to our first murder. If you look at the newspapers in late 1867 and early 1868, and there aren't many newspapers that survive, but if you look like at the Arkansas Gazette, there were some newspapers in Batesville that survived. There's probably the closest ones to here that we had pretty good runs of. There was a lot of animosity. There was a lot of anger in the state of Arkansas in late 1867 and early 1868, mainly by Southerners, by the old Confederates, who had had the seat of their britches kicked and had been told, you can't vote, you can't hold office, you're just not a full citizen anymore. They're angry about all this. And they often take their anger out on local officials. They're not gonna, most of these people are farmers, and they're just trying to get back on their feet after the long Civil War, and they can't just en masse get up and march to Little Rock and protest. So what they do is they take their anger out on local officials. And the most visible local officials in 1867 and 1868 were the voting registrars. Each county had 3 registrars who were in charge of the polls, who were in charge of making sure that the people who weren't supposed to vote didn't vote. So these voting registrars were almost always Union veterans, and a lot of times they were carpetbaggers. They were Northerners who had come south, and so they were already hated by the Southerners, and then you get the fact that they're Union veterans on top of that, and then you add to that their main job is to make sure that Confederates don't vote. Then they become very, very unpopular people. Well, in Lawrence County, and this is actually in what today is Sharp County, this because we know Evening Shade is in Sharp County, but at that time it was in Lawrence County. Sharp County would be created in 1868. So in 1867, we're still in Lawrence County, the western part of it. One of the voting registrars, a guy by the name of Uriah Douthit, is murdered on Christmas night. He leaves home to go on some kind of errand. He never comes back. His horse shows up at a neighbor's house the next day. Some unidentified guy comes by and claims the horse and leaves, and they never see him again. And then they find Uriah Douthit's body. Uriah Douthit was a pro-Union. We have no evidence, even though some of his descendants claim that he was a Union soldier, there's no evidence that he actually was an official Union soldier, but he was clearly a Union sympathizer during the Civil War. And he was a friend of Simpson Mason, our Freedmen's Bureau agent friend in Fulton County. They probably knew each other from being fellow refugees during the Civil War. Uriah Douthit, his family had settled in the Evening Shade area just right before the Civil War. He was somewhat well off. I found records where he owned several slaves and a mill in North. He was a Southerner. He was from North Carolina, and there were lots of slave owners who remained loyal to the Union. That was not an uncommon thing, and there were a lot of non-slave slave owners who joined the Confederacy. So that can get confusing sometimes to us. But Uriah Douthit was probably pretty well off and would have been resented just for that, if nothing else. And then he's a Union sympathizer, and he's a voting registrar. So he gets murdered, and Simpson Mason, the Freedmen's Bureau agent, with whom Douthit had been corresponding, Douthit was a little bit of what we might call a tattletale. One of the things he did is he would write letters to Simpson Mason saying, so-and-so is not paying so-and-so what he promised to pay them. And we have some of those letters that have survived in the Freedmen's Bureau records, where Douthit had come to the aid of a black man in Evening Shade who had signed a contract with a boss over there, and then apparently didn't get paid what he was supposed to get paid, and Douthit had told on him to the Freedmen's Bureau. And that's one of the things the Freedmen's Bureau did, was investigate these cases. They didn't always turn out to be cases of fraud, but sometimes they did. And then if they were, he could get the Army involved. Because remember, there's Union Army troops in places like Jacksonport and Batesville and scattered around because of this military Reconstruction. Well, we know from Simpson Mason's letters to headquarters in Little Rock of Freedmen's Bureau, he points the finger at 2 men in Evening Shade, James Huddleston and Anthony Wright. And I haven't been able to find out really anything about James Huddleston. I'm not even sure if James was his real name. There were lots of Huddlestons in that area, and they were a prominent family. But I do know something about Anthony Wright. Anthony Wright was not a native of Evening Shade. He probably wasn't even supposed to be in Evening Shade. But Anthony Wright was one of the most notorious Confederate guerrillas in southern Missouri during the Civil War. Anthony Wright, as a matter of fact, he was from the Rolla area. Most of you have probably been through Rolla on the way to St. Louis or something like that. That's where Anthony Wright was from. And Wright's family had been involved in a very memorable and tragic event shortly after the Civil War ended. Wright's father was a fellow by the name of Lewis Wright, who was a Confederate sympathizer. And Lewis Wright was a very prominent man in Phelps County, Missouri, which is where Rolla is. And Lewis Wright and all of his sons, except for Anthony, were arrested by Union militia just a couple months after the Civil War ended for crimes that Anthony had supposedly committed. Anthony was accused of killing a Union militia officer in Missouri during the Civil War, and of stealing his saddle and his guns and other things like that. Well, when the Union militia couldn't find Anthony, they arrested all of the men in his family. And marching them to the jailhouse at Rolla, the Union militia claimed that Lewis and his sons had tried to escape. And you see this a lot in official military records. They tried to escape and we gunned them down. Anymore, historians, when they see this in Civil War records, generally don't believe it. They just believe these people were taken out in the woods somewhere and executed. That's generally what happened. But all of the Wrights, except for Anthony, were gunned down by Union militia. So he certainly had a reason to be vengeful after the Civil War. Whether or not he had anything to do with the murder of Uriah Douthit, we don't know today, because no one was ever put on trial for that murder, and we just don't know. There just aren't enough records available to know if Anthony Wright had anything to do with it. But it tells you that all of these people knew each other. The pro-Union people and the pro-Confederate people, they had been fighting for 4 years during the Civil War, and they all knew each other. They knew who the bad guys on the other side were, and they knew who to point fingers at and who to blame for these things. And for them, the Civil War was still going on. I mean, this is an extension of the Civil War. If, in fact, Anthony Wright had something to do with the murder of Uriah Douthit, it is unquestionably an extension of the Civil War for him. And Simpson Mason's decision to blame the murder on Anthony Wright is an extension of the Civil War for him. This is a bad guy, and he must have done this. This is what people tell me. Even though I'm in Union, and it happened in Evening Shade, this is what I'm hearing from these people. So that's the backstory of Anthony Wright, and we'll finish his story after a while. But he was one of 4 Missouri guerrilla leaders, Confederate guerrilla leaders, who had a bounty on their head at the end of the Civil War, who fled the state. And we will now meet another one of those, a fellow by the name of Dick Kitchen. So just a few months after the murder of Uriah Douthit, Dick Kitchen, who was a first cousin of Anthony Wright, and was also from Phelps County, Missouri, from the Rolla area, and also had a bounty on his head, which I've read was anywhere from $300 to $1,000, certainly enough to get somebody out of bed and go hunt for him in those days. Well, Dick Kitchen, we know, was gunned down in Evening Shade. Depending on which newspaper account you read, he was either killed at the post office, which probably was somebody's house at that time, or at a blacksmith shop, or there was a third place that I saw. He apparently died all over town. Maybe in my mind, I just got this image of him being shot and stumbling from store to store, so everybody could claim that he was shot at their place. But Dick Kitchen was killed there. Another one of the most notorious of the Confederate guerrilla leaders from southern Missouri, and this was in April of '68, and so we know that this could have been revenge. I mean, it could have been revenge for the Douthit murder. Perhaps Dick Kitchen was involved in the Douthit murder, if his cousin Anthony Wright was involved in the Douthit murder. And you might wonder, what are these people doing in Arkansas? Well, Arkansas was safer territory for them than southern Missouri was. Even under Republican control in the state, as Arkansas was fixing to be under Republican control, it was still safer for them to be in a place like Lawrence County or Sharp County, Arkansas, or Fulton County, Arkansas, than it was to be up in Missouri, where there were a lot more pro-Union people than there were pro-Confederate people left. And here is, that's not a good map, and I'm not even sure if I can tell what's going on here. This one actually has Sharp County. Someone has misspelled it by putting an E on the end of it. But I think that's going to be the Strawberry River, and Evening Shade should be, I think Evening Shade's right in here. I think that says Evening Shade. So if you're not familiar with that, we're going to be up here, Summers, somewhere in there, and Evening Shade's down here. So just a couple counties over. So a lot was happening in Evening Shade in 1860. Who knew that it was that all that was going on there? So tensions continued to build in Arkansas politics in 1868. We know that the so-called radical Republicans take over the state government in 1868. They enact a new constitution. Remember, the old Confederates have been cut out of the process, so they don't have any say-so in this. There's a new governor elected, and he's pictured there, a nice-looking guy, nice suit, Powell Clayton. He was had been a Union officer from Kansas. He was originally from Pennsylvania, but had been in a Kansas unit. And if you know anything about the Civil War, if you were a Confederate west of the Mississippi, any Union soldier who served in a Kansas unit, you automatically hated. They were jayhawkers to you. Even if they were legitimate Union troops, they were considered jayhawkers. And the Missouri Confederates hated the Kansas jayhawkers, as did the Arkansas Confederates. So he would have been very unpopular with most of the people in the state of Arkansas, but most of the people in the state of Arkansas couldn't vote in 1868, so he didn't have to worry about that just yet.
People in Missouri still hate those people, but that's another story.
It carries on in football and basketball today. So what happens is, after the Republicans take over the state government of Arkansas, and this happens across the South, this is not just an Arkansas story, but across the South, this is when you get the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. This is the Nathan Bedford Forrest Ku Klux Klan. This is not the 1950s Ku Klux Klan or the 1920s this is the original Ku Klux Klan. And the purpose of the Ku Klux Klan was to try to use violence and intimidation and terrorism to reestablish the control of the old Democrats, or the old Confederates, now the Democrats, over the state of Arkansas's political system. They wanted to intimidate black people, but in a place like North Arkansas, where there were very few black people, their goal was to intimidate pro-Union people, intimidate Republicans, to maybe scare them out of the state, to keep them from showing up on election day by threatening to shoot them or to beat them up. So the Ku Klux Klan did all the things we associate with the Ku Klux Klan, night riding and terrorism and all that kind of stuff. And their goal was to reassert their control over the state. And this happened in other states as well in 1868. And there was a whole big Ku Klux Klan problem around the South in 1868 and 1869. And this comes home to roost here in North Arkansas as well. And that's when we get to our next murder. And that's our friend Simpson Mason, the Freedmen's Bureau agent. He's one of, I think there was one other Freedmen's Bureau agent in the state of Arkansas who was killed in the line of duty during Reconstruction. But Simpson Mason certainly is one of these. He is gunned down on the morning of September 19th, 1868. He was out with another guy on official business in the western part of his county. If you know where Vidette is in Fulton County, in the northwestern part of Fulton County, south of Bakersfield, that's where, at that time it was known as Bennett's Bayou. There's still a Bennett's Bayou, an actual creek called Bennett's Bayou there, and there's Bennett's River there. It's very confusing that they've got all kinds of Bennett's stuff going on. But at that time, the community was known as Bennett's Bayou, and that's where he was shot down in basically what today is Vidette. Well, immediately, the pro-union militia of Fulton County started together in Salem. And they pointed the fingers at the two men that they thought had committed this crime, and they were brothers, the Tracy brothers. If you know where Tracy is, on the lake, that's the same family. That's the Tracy family. The old Tracy community was basically owned by their father. He was the one who settled here shortly before the Civil War and owned most of what today is Tracy on the west side of the North Fork of the White River, and of course it's North Fork Lake today. Nathaniel Tracy had a farm on the east side of the North Fork River, just across the river from his dad's place. And Harry Tracy had a farm north of Mountain Home, just north of the mouth of Pigeon Creek. Harry Tracy was a neighbor to my great-great-great-grandparents. And my great-great-great-grandfather was killed right around this same time. And family legend has it that he was killed by jayhawkers or bushwhackers, and we don't know, we just don't have the facts, but I think it almost has to have something to do with all the mayhem that was going on in Fulton County, what now is Baxter County at that time. But that's where Harry Tracy lived. Both of them were Confederate veterans, and as you can see, they had been officers. Nathaniel Tracy was in the 14th Arkansaw, and Colonel Harry Tracy had an outfit of irregulars. He was one of these kind of bushwhacker leaders, and he was very notorious in northern Arkansas and southern Missouri for raiding pro-union people during the Civil War. So he was very much hated, and all of the pro-union people would have had it out for Harry Tracy. But the reason that the Tracys had connections over in that area, Harry Tracy had married a young woman from the Vidette area. If you know Fulton County, where Pickering Hall is, the old Pickering family, he had married one of the Pickering girls. The Pickerings were a prominent family at that time, and so he was hanging out over at Mrs. Pickering's, the widow Pickering's place, and that's why he was in the area of Vidette. So he could have committed this murder. We don't know. That's kind of the story of this era. We never really know who does anything. We know who's accused of doing things, and we know people get killed, but no one's ever brought to justice for any of these crimes. It's just a series of revenge killings that happen. So the local militia gather up to get these two Tracy brothers. They can't find them, and I'll tell you why in a minute. They can't find the Tracy brothers. They do find yet another Tracy brother, their younger brother Joseph. They arrest him. They arrest a fellow by the name of Uriah Bush. Who knew Uriah was such a popular name in the mid-1800s? But they arrest Uriah Bush. They arrest two other men as well. So this militia unit, it's basically the county sheriff and his deputies and the local unionist militia all working together to arrest these four men. And they hold them in what today is Vidette for a couple of days. And that's when our friend William Monks shows up. And anything that happens in this era in North Arkansas or South Central Missouri, Monks is going to be involved in. So if you haven't heard of William Monks, he is a notorious Union guerrilla, I guess you could is what you would call William Monks, who had been captured by Confederates early in the war and had been kind of radicalized by his experience being mistreated by Confederates as a prisoner of war. He had escaped. Made his way up to Rolla, volunteered as a scout for the Union Army, and Monks just had this intense hatred for Confederates. Monks actually had grown up here in this area, in the Bennett's Bayou area. That's where he was from. But shortly before the war, He had moved up into Howell County, Missouri, and that's where he spent the rest of his life, in the West Plains area. But Monks brings his Howell County militia down after he hears all this stuff happening. 4 days after the murder, he shows up, and he was a friend of Simpson Mason. All these people knew each other. They were all pro-Union refugees, and they were all friends with each other, and they had been scouts together probably. And so Monks and his men come down, and I've seen anything from 25 to 100 men. I don't know, we don't know exactly how many of these Howell County militiamen he brought with him, but they came down to Vidette. They went up to the sheriff and his men and said, give us your prisoners. And they outnumbered the sheriff and his men, so he gave them his prisoners. And everybody kind of knew William Monks, and he's probably a little scared of William Monks. He was kind of a loose cannon, didn't know what he would do. And so he handed over the 4 prisoners to William Monks. Monks then sent his men out, and they arrested yet a 5th prisoner, a fellow by the name of L.D. Bryant, Lorenzo Dow Bryant. And Mr. Bryant probably still has descendants in Fulton County, or this area today. Bryant was arrested and brought. Monks made his headquarters at the Pickering Farm. And this was by design. He was basically saying, okay, Harry Tracy, if you're going to run off like a chicken, we're going to sit down on your wife's home place. We're going to kill all the cattle. We're going to eat all the hogs. We're going to take all the corn. And we're just going to lay waste to this area. And so for about 3 or 4 days, Monks and his men went up and down Bennett's River, sacking all of the farms of the people they knew to be Southern sympathizers. So it was a very dangerous place to be, whichever side you were on at that time. And especially if you were pro-Confederate when Monks was around. They reportedly tortured Bryant, trying to get him to implicate some of the other guys in the crime. Though we know that Bryant eventually escapes, even though the newspapers reported that he had been hung to death. It turns out that if he was hung, it took him about 6 years to die, because he didn't die until 1874. He died in Louisiana only after his wife had divorced him. I found the records in the Fulton County courthouse for that, and had to change that part of the story, because he didn't die in this part. But so on the 26th, a week after the murder of Simpson Mason, and while Monks and his men are still holding these 5 prisoners, Elisha Baxter, the namesake of Baxter County, he's not governor yet, but he will become governor. At that time, he was the circuit judge for north central Arkansas. Baxter lived in Batesville, but his circuit extended all the way to Fulton County. And he issued a writ of habeas corpus. And what a writ of habeas corpus says is, give us that body, or give us those people you're holding. And so a Fulton County deputy shows up with a couple of friends, a little posse there. They show up at Monks' headquarters at the Pickering Farm, and they say, here, this is from Judge Baxter. He says, you've got to hand over your prisoners to us. We've got to see that they go through the legal process. You just can't have them out here torturing them and not put them on some kind of trial or have some kind of hearing for them. And so Monks hands over 2 of the prisoners. We don't really know what happened to the other 2. We think they either released them or they escaped or something. But he hands over 2 of the prisoners. He hands over Joseph Tracy and Uriah Bush. And that's when we get to our next murder. The Fulton County deputy and his men are taking Tracy and Bush back to Salem, which at that time several people still referred to as Pilot Hill. And they're taking them back to Salem. And on the way back, they're met by a group of masked men. Well, the way it's described in the newspapers, the men were actually wearing newspapers on their heads. Or they had kind of formed newspapers into masks, I guess, cut holes out, where they, just so they could conceal themselves, their identities. And these masked men demanded that the 2 prisoners be handed over to them. The logical thing is to say these were some of Monks' men who just wanted these prisoners back, and it probably was. But again, we don't know exactly who these masked men were. They probably were Monks' men who had sort of got out around the posse somehow. They grabbed Uriah Bush. Before they could grab Joseph Tracy, the deputy grabbed the reins of the horse that Tracy was riding on and took off, and was able to outrun these masked men. But they killed Uriah Bush. His body was found the next day. And Uriah Bush has a tragic story as well. Family memory has it in the Bush family that two of his sons, one of them was named George Bush, as a matter of fact, were little boys. They were killed by the Alsops. And if you know anything about the Civil War in South Central Missouri, the Alsops were a notorious pro-Union family and kind of clan there. And apparently Bush had gotten crossways with the Alsops, and two of his sons had been killed right around the end of the Civil War, an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, by the Alsops. And then Bush meets his demise here. His wife would give birth to their last child shortly after this, and then she moved to Texas to be near her family. But Bush is killed. Joseph Tracy is delivered safely back to Salem, and he is soon released by the county authorities in Salem. About this same time, the Ku Klux Klan gets involved. The Klan had heard that Monks and his militia had rushed down from Missouri into Arkansas, and there were a couple of prominent Klan leaders in North Arkansas at that time. One of them lived in the Batesville area, and his name was George Rutherford, and another one lived in Lawrence County, and his name was Robert Shaver. Some of you may have heard the name Colonel Fightin' Bob Shaver. Well, Fightin' Bob Shaver became the most notorious Klan leader in the state of Arkansas. And Fightin' Bob Shaver and George Rutherford gathered up 600 or more Klansmen from Independence County, the Batesville area, from Jackson County, the Newport area, from Izard County, from Lawrence County. And they came marching up to Fulton County to go to war with Monks. Well, by this time, Monks probably only had about 25 men left, and he heard they were coming, and he skedaddled back to West Plains before they got here. But for a few days, the Ku Klux Klan rampaged around Fulton County. And they were, of course, targeting pro-Union people. So it was one of those things that if you thought you were lucking out when it was Monks and his men targeting your Confederate neighbors, well, in a couple of days, you're the one who's going to be losing your hogs and your corn to this invading group of Ku Klux Klansmen. So it's more mayhem for Fulton County. Eventually, the governor of Arkansas, Governor Clayton, we've already met, he eventually calls out the state militia and declares martial law in a number of counties in the state of Arkansas, including Fulton County. He sends a unit of state militia into Fulton County. He probably muddies the waters by inviting Monks to come back down from West Plains and to help patrol the area. And so for a few months, Monks and his men travel around Fulton and Izard County and even all the way down to Batesville, terrorizing ex-Confederate people. And so you've got this situation where the Klansmen are eventually driven out of Fulton County. They're sort of driven over into eastern Arkansas and eventually suppressed. Arkansas actually does the most thorough job of any of the southern states of putting down the Ku Klux Klan in 1868 and 1869. Pretty much all historians of the Reconstruction era agree that Governor Clayton was the most effective governor in putting an end to Klan violence in his state. And Colonel Robert Shaver was eventually arrested, though obviously this is a much older picture of him. He gets out of jail and eventually becomes a revered Confederate colonel in memory, and becomes a very important person in the Confederate veterans movement around the nation. So the legacy of this murder and mayhem, as I already mentioned, Arkansas ends up suppressing the KKK with the state militia. No one is ever brought to justice for any of these murders that we've seen. We know that the KKK committed at least 2 revenge murders. One of the KKK members who came up from the Batesville area later wrote a memoir and mentioned that they had killed 2 of Monks's men in revenge for these other killings. But by being so aggressive and brutal and putting down the KKK, Governor Clayton unwittingly leads to the end of his own political party's power. The Republican Party, in large part because of this, because of the brutal activity of the Arkansas State Militia, breaks up in 1869 and eventually splinters apart, opening the door for the Democrats to come back in, which they do in 1874. The Democrats take back over the state of Arkansas in 1874, and it's in part due to Elisha Baxter, for whom Baxter County was named just the year before when he was governor of Arkansas. Baxter, one of his campaign promises was to give the vote back to the old Confederates when he became governor of Arkansas, even though he was a pro-union guy, and he actually did that. He followed through with his promise. And when he gave the vote back to Confederates, the next election, they swept the elections, enacted their own new constitution, and took over power of the state. So Arkansas returns to Democrat control. And as I mentioned, no one was ever brought to justice. As for the Tracy brothers, the ones who were Baxter County people, or what would become Baxter County people, they go on to prominent lives and careers in the state of Texas. A lot of these people escaped to Texas, and that there was really no accident why these people were going to Texas. During the Civil War, Texas had been seen as a safe haven for Confederates from Missouri and from North Arkansas. Many of them would even take their slaves all the way to Texas to keep their slaves from being captured by Union troops or set free by Union troops. And so it's no surprise that these people, just a few years after the war, would escape to Texas. If you read the biographies, Harry Tracy became an important political leader in the populist movement in Texas, and something called the Farmers Alliance, which started in Texas. His brother, Nathaniel Tracy, became a Texas state representative. And that's why under his picture it said Milam County. There is no Milam County, Arkansas. That's Milam County, Texas. If you read their biographies, and they were important enough that there are short biographies of them today, short biographical sketches, not books. But neither one of their biographies say anything about all of this. And you would barely even know they ever spent time in Arkansas from reading their biographical sketches. It's clear that whatever their involvement was in this, they didn't talk about it in later years. And even several years ago, the Fulton County Chronicles, or whatever the Fulton County Historical Society's little journal that they used to do, they had some kind of family memories of the Tracys that were published probably 30 or 40 years ago. And in those family memories, the reasons given for their moving from what was then Fulton County to Texas never mentioned this. I mean, they were, we can read them now and see they were kind of made up reasons that Nathaniel and Harry had probably told their descendants, and their descendants believed these reasons. But they ended up in Texas, no worse for the wear, had successful careers, as did Mrs. Bush, and a lot of the people involved in this left the area and never came back. And it's after 1868 things calmed down in North Arkansas. A lot of that's because the Klan was suppressed, and everyone, all the pro-Confederates thought, well, maybe we'll just wait this out, which is probably what they should have thought a few years before they triggered military Reconstruction. But at this point they decided, we'll just wait this out. And sure enough, in half a dozen years, their waiting ended in the Democrats retaking control of the state of Arkansas, and Elisha Baxter being booted out of the governor's office unceremoniously before his term was even up, even though he's the one who had helped get them their votes back. But that's the story of murder and mayhem in North Arkansas. It's a kind of a convoluted story, and I'll be glad to try to answer any questions you might have, because it is sort of a confusing jumble of murders and events.
Please tell me what it says on that stone.
Yeah, it says Tracy. It says Colonel Harry Tracy, CSA, 1840 to 1915. So he lived a long time after all of this happened. Yeah.
That is in Texas.
That is that's in the panhandle of Texas. I can't remember the name of the little town. But Harry Tracy died in the panhandle. His brother died down near Austin. So they didn't actually live near each other, but they both ended up in Texas.
Did they have children that stayed in the city?
They wouldn't have had children who stayed in the area. They would have been too young at that time to have. I mean, they took their families with them. There may have been other Tracys who stayed in the area. I'm not sure if if there were other Tracys who remained here. I just don't know.
Was it common to arrest people for things they did during the war, after the war?
You weren't supposed to do that, but it did happen sometimes. There was actually there was a case. I think this was in Randolph County, Arkansas, which is over in the Pocahontas area. There was a case that I saw in the Freedmen's Bureau records where some pro-Confederate county officials had tried to arrest a former Union guerrilla for actions that he had taken during the Civil War. And of course the Army stepped in, the U.S. Army stepped in and said, you can't do that. We're exempting all of our boys from whatever they did in the war. You can't hold them responsible now. Now it may not always work that way. If it was Confederate that they were arresting, and the Union authorities were, might have been in favor of that. But certainly there were ways of settling old scores without going out and arresting people and putting them in jail. And those included assassination. Those could include things like William Monks was notorious for suing former Confederates in the courts in Howe County and ending up with their land and various kinds of property. Monks did, there are a lot of records where Monks did that. And if you get a favorable pro-union jury or judge, certainly you can circumvent the law that way. So there were ways of settling scores beyond just having people arrested.
Since you're a history professor, I've often wondered why our government didn't do what England did and pay people for their slaves. It would have been such a tremendous, easily done way, so much cheaper than running a whole war and causing all the havoc and misery that it did. Why didn't they do that like England did?
Well, a couple reasons. One is that you're talking about a whole bunch more slaves.
It still would have been cheaper, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, it would have been cheaper in terms of the loss of life and the money spent in the war, but I mean, that's all hindsight. You're talking about a whole lot more slaves and of course, a lot of people in the North wouldn't have been in favor of that. I mean, they would have been in favor of manumitting the slaves, but not paying their owners. So that was probably a political no-go. And then, obviously, there are lots and lots of slave owners in the South who, even if you paid them, wouldn't have wanted to give up their slaves because that was the labor source. That was the key to Southern wealth for plantation owners in the Deep South, especially. It wasn't slavery wealth wasn't that important for a place like this, where there were fewer than 100 slaves in Fulton County at the time of the Civil War. So obviously that would have been a good solution here. But in Mississippi and Alabama and places like that, the slave owners would have said, "Where are we going to get our labor? Who's going to do who's going to do the work?" And obviously, the labor system would have adjusted. But they weren't going to take any chances. But you're right. Certainly if they had taken that step 40 or 50 years before the Civil War, before slavery had become so entrenched and so integral to the Southern economy, then that could have been. But But it's all, it's all what could have been, all hindsight.
Oh, just one more thing. When you're teaching, I'm sure you have students that come up to you years later and say, golly, you really got me going on this particular part of history. I had a teacher in 8th grade, her name is Swanson, and I love the Civil War, all because of her. And to this day, I read everything I can about this period, and it just fascinates me. And I'll bet you've had students that you've gone to this sort of thing and be fascinated with it like I have been. And it's gratifying to you to hear.
Yeah, it is. It is. Occasionally, you have one of those students, and of course I had teachers like that. And but yeah, you're right. Yeah, hopefully I'm the Mrs. Swanson for somebody out there. Yeah, I hope so.
As a spin-off from that
Yeah.
statement rather than question, have you published any of this like in a paper?
No, this will be, I am beginning next year, I have a trilogy on the history of the Ozarks that's coming out. The first volume will be out next year. It's called the Old Ozarks. The Old Ozarks is a history of the Ozarks before the Civil War. And then the second volume will be the Civil War era volume, and it will come out in 2019. And there is a much more abbreviated version of this story, and that because it's a book about the Civil War era in the whole region, so I can't spend like a whole chapter talking about this. But there's a brief version of this story, and that's going to be called The Conflicted Ozarks when it comes out, and it'll be out in, well, like I said, 2019, a little less than 2 years from now, and then the third volume will be out in 2020. And that's hard to believe that we're going to be a fifth of the way through the 21st century.
You might want to get out a little earlier. Some of us might not make that.
Well, yeah, I may not make it by the time. I'm starting to wonder about it now.
You
But
don't have any article on this?
no, my plan is I'll just let you in on my secret plan here.
I'd have taken more notes.
Yeah. My plan is to turn this into a standalone article, maybe for like the Arkansaw Historical Quarterly or something like that. But that would be at least a couple years down the road before it's the academic publishing process is a really, really slow process.
I would love to have
yeah.
this book. Oh.
Yeah. Well, I would love for you to, and it'll be out in a couple years.
The man who was supposedly hanged,
Mm-hmm.
how did you come across the records that his death occurred at a different time, like 6 years later?
Yeah, I had, and actually, when I first wrote this in the book that's going to be called The Conflicted Ozarks, I had L.D. Bryant, Lorenzo Del Bryant, I had him dying at the hands of Monks' men. And I was in Salem in the Fulton County Courthouse, just looking for other related materials. Just kind of looking for things from any of these people who were involved to see if there were repercussions after Fulton County's records burnt in 1870, and so you only start in 1870 there. And I just happened to be looking in some of the old ledger books there, and came across the records of his wife suing for divorce. And this was a few years after he supposedly had been hanged by Monks' men, and I kept looking, and his name kept popping up. People were suing him right and left. And I don't doubt that it could have been sort of like Monks suing ex-Confederates in Howell County as revenge, because at this time, Fulton County still would have been under Republican control in the early 1870s. And it's possible that some of these suits were Union people who were taking revenge on L.D. Bryant. But then I later found out, just kind of in the notes of one of these ledger books, it was mentioned that his lawyer informed the court that he had died in Louisiana in 1874. Now, whether or not he did, or he just just wanted to get out from under all these suits and had his lawyer tell the court that he died and he changed his name or something. I don't know, but he was certainly alive after 1868. We do know that. You know, and there was if you go to find a grave, there's an LD Bryant who's buried, I think at Vidette, who I guess is his son or grandson. So his family actually stayed here, stayed with his wife, obviously, and that confused me at first. I got to looking at the dates, and the dates were wrong, and so that's why I said his descendants may still be around. I don't know any Bryants in Fulton County, but there may be some. Are there some? Yeah, yeah.
Are you related to Bill Blevins?
The deceased Bill Blevins who wrote the
Teacher?
yeah,
The teacher?
yeah, at Cotter and different places. Bill was Bill and my dad were second cousins.
We all had him in school.
Oh, did you?
He was mean.
Oh, really? Well, I was going to say his dad was mean. I knew his, and I probably shouldn't say that, but his dad had the reputation for being mean too. His dad lived in Violet Hill when I was a boy, growing up there, and so Bill was mean. I didn't know that. I didn't know. I always liked Bill, but we were kinfolk, and so he wouldn't be mean to. The only reason he would have been mean to me is Bill was an Alabama graduate and I'm an Auburn graduate, and that could have caused problems. But we just set that aside and stuck with our last names.
Bill's dad was my neighbor when I was
Leonard? Yeah, Leonard. Bill's the one who told me his dad was mean. So I don't remember having any problems with Leonard.
No, I don't.
But I do know Leonard changed the spelling of his name. So apparently he didn't like the rest of us.
Bill was nice to me, I don't know what problem.
Well, he was nice to good students, I think.